Welcome to Lecture 7 of History of Christian Worship Practices. As we look at worship in the early Christian centuries of the early Christian church, this is the last of 3 lectures on this time period, and today we're going to be talking about architecture, music, art, and preaching. Probably the biggest change during this period had to do with architecture. Because of Constantine's support of Christianity, many churches moved from homes into large buildings called basilicas, and they were given to Christians by the towns and the other cultures and leaders. Basilicas were civil buildings used for public meetings and court hearings. They are subsequently well equipped for church gatherings with a place for the bishop up front to present and all the people to gather in front of him. So here we see the Basilica of Constantine in Rome, and it was built around 300 AD. In a typical basilica worship service, the audience never sat down and was separated by the sexes. The priest presided from a throne with an altar table between him and the congregation. Here's a picture of the Basilica of Constantine in Germany, or was also known as the Aula Palatina at Trier, Germany. And it was built, again, early 300s, around 306 to 337 AD, at the beginning of the 4th century. The Aula Palatina was built right around 310 as part of the palace complex. Originally, it was not freestanding building, but it had other small buildings, such as a forehall, a vestibule, and some service buildings. And again, it was part of a large palace all the way up in Germany from Rome. The Aula Palatina was equipped with a floor and a wall heating system, a hypocaust. So it was running water that they would run to regulate the temperature in the building. Trier is in the western portion of Germany, south of Cologne, and it's near Luxembourg in France. So you can see the size and scope if you see the picture of the cars. You can see it's not a large building, but it is probably about the size of a small gymnasium. And you can also see the chairs there as well. Again, everyone stood at this time when the building was built and being used. Pews actually wouldn't be a part of church buildings for another few centuries. This is another basilica. The Basilica of Saint Sabina was built by Peter of Illyria, and he was from Dalmatia. He was a Dalmatian priest. No, he did not have spots. It was built between 422 and 432, and it was actually built near the temple of Juno on the Aventine Hill in Rome. So this was a different culture, hundreds of years after the Roman Empire, and 100 years after the Roman Empire had fallen, but hundreds of years after Rome had kicked out all of the Christians, it was being rebuilt and reclaimed under this new emperor. So it's a 4th century house of Sabina, a Roman matron, originally from Avezzano in the Abruzzo region. Sabina was beheaded under Emperor Vespasian, or perhaps Hadrian, because she had converted to Christianity by her servant, Seraphia, who was stoned to death. So she was later declared a Christian saint. So these early Christians were being honored by the basilicas and churches that were being built in their name and in the places where Christians had been formally prosecuted. And you can see the dome at the front end and the art that was painted inside of that, and also the high windows and the lower windows underneath the arches. Quite beautiful building that was all lit by sunlight. And yet it's quite dark when we compare it to the cathedrals of the Renaissance, which we will look at in a later lecture. Art was already being created for worship. Liturgical art that had a resurrection theme, Daniel, Jonah, Lazarus coming out of the grave, rising up from the pit, coming out of the fish. Many were Old Testament, but they all alluded to the resurrection of Christ. The cross itself did not appear until the 4th century as a symbol of Christianity, and the crucifix with Jesus on the cross not until the 7th century. I like how James White puts it. He says, the churches were learning a new visual vocabulary, one image at a time. So as they had new symbols and new visual representations of their faith, they would express that in their buildings because now they had a common gathering place. And these artifacts and this different forms of visual communication actually communicated a lot more to the people than the priest often did. Music in the early church was still simple, and it was still sung in unison. It was often sung in response to the choir or the priest and bishop, and the choir in this case would be church musicians that were ordained or set aside, and their role was to sing the scripture. It makes sense that a response style of music would be appropriate in a culture where music was not written down. So the worship leader would sing a phrase, and the congregation would sing a fixed line in response. And this is an easy way to remember a song. This is often called an antiphon. Many groups did not even use instruments, and especially they didn't use them because they were being set apart from other pagan religions who used lots of instruments. Some, even St. Augustine, saw music as controversial and even manipulative or coercive, which we are challenged with that today. Let me read from White's text on page 71. It said, Augustine confesses how greatly he enjoyed the singing of the church in Milan and how this contributed to his conversion, but at the same time he has fears that singing is too attractive. He ponders having music banished. Quote, Preaching became a major component of worship. As rhetoric skills and persuasive language began to be used in preaching, it was adopted from the pagan cultures of Greece and Rome. So Socrates, Aristotle, these philosophers had developed a way of communicating and debating their thoughts, and that was adapted into Christianity. Remember, at this time, Christianity was the religion of the land, yet most of the faithful were quite ignorant of what they believed. They just knew that they were in a Christian culture now, and they were Christians instead of Muslim or Greek or any other of the ancient religions. So while church wasn't an evangelical opportunity, it was still a time for many to understand the foundational theology of Christianity. So the preaching became apologetic and persuasive. The 4th and 5th centuries specifically produced some of the greatest preachers of all time, listed here: Augustine, Ambrose, Jerome, Cyril, John Chrysostom, and Leo I. Along with preaching, we see leadership beginning to be developed a bit more. And part of this was just because of the size of the church and the organizational structure that needed to be developed. Bishop, elder, and deacon remained, and it were solidified during this time as appropriate leadership from Scripture. And bishops ordained other bishops as churches would be planted and would form within cities and within cultures. Other positions of leadership we begin to see, especially if we look at the historical documents and accounts. Deaconesses, we see some writings in the 4th century of women deacons. We also see subdeacons, so assistant servants, and readers, those who would be skilled to read the scripture or to read letters or to read the other theological documents of the time. So in review, we can go through and look at each of these different worship forms and see how they started to adapt. Remember, in the Old Testament, in the patriarchal times, worship began just as a household or a family event. And then it grew as the tribes grew, and it grew into having a temple or tabernacle-centered organized faith with priests and Levites. And then it grew into the temple extravagant worship. And then after the after the Israelites were taken into captivity, then it became a family worship component again, as people held on to their faith privately. On the return and into the New Testament, we see the organized faith expressed in synagogues and local congregations. And then this developed into Christian worship, which it was still local and small, but unorganized. And now, these first few centuries after Christ, we see the church starting to organize and become a stronger structure as Christianity grew. So we see geography and cultural diversity. Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire. There's more uniformed worship details, including more formal and fixed worship forms like communion and baptism, ordination, creeds, and specific prayers. The church began to meet in church buildings like the basilicas and other larger gathering places. The 8 prayers of the daily office began to be developed at this time, and preaching was developed greatly. This is the end of our early church Christianity discussion.